What is the trans movement? Where did it come from? Why are so many of our teenagers today all over social media claiming to be, if they're a male, trapped in a male's body, but really a female, or vice versa, claiming to be a biological female who's trapped in a man's body? What is all this about? Where did it come from? Well, today we're going to talk about the ancient religious heresy, the mystery religion, really, of Gnosticism. And by the end of this podcast, you will understand the connection between Gnosticism, critical theory, and the trans movement today. So hello and welcome to Later Than You Think. I'm your host, Jeff Sidarius, and I want to welcome you today. Before we delve in, I want to say a couple of things. First of all, I am coming to you today from the new, I guess I'd call it Podcast Central, the sound room in our home that's now up and running. I want to thank Dan Leisinga of Leisinga Construction in Lansing, Illinois, for building this along with his sons and his other contractors. They did a magnificent job. Also want to mention that this podcast has now topped 100 downloads, which is amazing to me. I never expected that within this period of time. I have done zero promotion on this podcast other than a little bit of word of mouth through friends. And along those lines, this podcast is now available on Audible, which means that it's now on, I think, something like 5 platforms: Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, and Audible. So if you like what you hear, you may subscribe to this podcast on any of those platforms. And please feel free to leave a review, and we'll give an email address for feedback at the end of today's episode. Today's episode I'm calling Gnosticism, Rebelling Against Reality. Now, why are we talking about this? Well, what we're doing here is we're trying to understand and study the roots of the woke movement that we are seeing that has taken over and is influencing so much of our society, culture, politics, academic discourse, and so forth today. And for the last episodes up till now, we've been focusing on Marxism, neo-Marxism, critical theory, all of which is a huge influence on today's woke movement. Today, I'm going to shift gears. Some of you are probably saying, yay, finally. We're going to shift gears and talk about what I believe to be the second major influence on today's woke movement, which is Gnosticism. Gnosticism has been called by some the ultimate heresy. It's been around really since the time that the New Testament was written down. It's my belief and the belief of many biblical scholars that Gnosticism was present in the geographic area in which the New Testament books were written at that time, and that at least in part, the New Testament writers were writing against Gnosticism and explaining why Gnosticism was inconsistent with the teachings of Jesus, as well as the Old Testament. We'll get into that in more detail. So let's get going. What is Gnosticism and why should we care? Well, Gnosticism comes from the Greek word gnosis. The G is silent. It's spelled Gnosis. And Gnosticism is really an ancient Near Eastern mystery religion, or I would say cult, which is basically a parasite. It hijacks certain Christian concepts as well as concepts from non-Christian religions, and it tries to create a sort of a narrative or mix of beliefs that, when you look at it carefully, is completely different from and opposed to biblical Christianity, really almost to the point of being a caricature of Christianity. It is not a formal religion. In other words, it's not a formal church with denominational structure and a body of doctrine and so forth. You're not going to walk down the main street in your town and come to the first Gnostic church. It doesn't work that way. It's a loosely held set of beliefs, generally followed by small sects of people. It faded out of the Christian world pretty dramatically around the end of the 4th century after Christ, but it has popped up periodically in the history of the church since then, many times over the last 2,000 years. And more to the point, it is making a big comeback in today's culture as traditional Christianity, or what we might call Orthodox Christianity, Orthodox in the sense of straight Christian doctrine as taught by the apostles for 2,000 years, not in the sense of Greek Orthodox or Russian Orthodox. But we've got today a very big comeback as that traditional Christianity wanes from the American culture. And if you doubt that, all you have to do is look at the phenomenal popularity a few years ago of the book and the movie called The Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown, which takes some of the Gnostic writings and tries to argue that they should be considered as being on the same level as the New Testament, a claim that is completely and utterly false, as I think we will see. So I believe, and I hope to show you today, that Gnosticism is a very substantial influence on the woke movement today, and in particular, those parts of the woke movement that go under the names of queer theory, gender theory, and particularly the transsexual movement. And I think the influence of Gnosticism and its continuing popularity is not because somebody did a great job of advocating for them, but it's just because the ideas are attractive and flattering to the human psyche. You actually, and I'm not going to go down a rabbit trail here, but you can very clearly document the influence of Gnostic ideas in modern psychology, for example, and you can hear Gnostic ideas. Sometimes I even hear them coming out of my own mouth, and you will hear them sometimes even coming out of the mouths of Christian believers, because they tend to be more and more pervasive in our culture today. All right, so what is Gnosticism, and what, if anything, does it have to do with Christianity? Well, first of all, Gnosticism gets its name, as we said, from the word knowledge, the Greek word for knowledge. And the core concept of Gnosticism is secret knowledge. In other words, knowledge that's not generally available to people, but can only be obtained by people who are enlightened, who have seen the light, so to speak, who have learned this secret knowledge. Does that sound familiar? It's almost like someone is woke. And we'll talk about what the content of this secret knowledge is. Now, what are the major themes? So first of all, the one major theme of Gnosticism that you have to understand is this is an idea that's adopted largely from Greek philosophy. Gnosticism teaches that the material world is evil. Only the spiritual is good. Philosophers call this dualism. And second, because the material world and everything in it is evil, the Creator God that we see in the book of Genesis in the Bible is also evil and cannot be the real God. So if you follow this line of thinking, then that necessarily leads to the conclusion that Jesus could not have come in the flesh. To the Gnostic, no self-respecting deity would ever lower himself to getting involved in that lowly, evil, material flesh. And this, of course, leads Gnosticism into a head-on conflict with the New Testament. The place you see this best is 1 John chapter 4, where we have really the test of Christian orthodoxy, if you will, where John says, "Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God. For many false prophets have gone out into the world. By this you know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God, and every spirit that does not confess Jesus is not from God." And you see the same thing from the same gospel writer, the Apostle John, in John chapter 1, verse 14, in John's famous prologue where he says, "The Word," which is, of course, a reference to Jesus, "became flesh and dwelt among us." Same idea. So for the Gnostic, Jesus becomes a great spiritual teacher, much like other spiritual teachers, Buddha and so forth. And Jesus did not come to save us from our sins, but rather to save us from our ignorance and to lead us to the secret knowledge that we need. Let's go through this in a little bit more depth because I think it's important to understand the main themes that I've just tried to state. So Gnosticism, as opposed to Christianity, you always start in Christian theology with the theology of God. And for the Gnostic, because matter is evil, the Gnostic has to deny any direct link between God and his creation. In other words, the creator God in Gnosticism, in Gnostic thinking, could not have any contact or do anything to do, and has nothing to do with physical creation, in other words, the material world. And you might be thinking, well, how do you get that? Well, the answer is it's difficult for the Gnostic, and how they do it is they create a speculative, an entirely speculative hierarchy of gods or deities that exist above the God of the Bible. So in other words, in Gnostic thought, the God of the Bible is essentially demoted to being a lower and actually a more or less evil deity. So the creation is seen as being an accident, which is the fault of this lesser deity, Jehovah, the God of the Old Testament or the Bible. Gnostic says the real God is actually several levels above him and is essentially pure thought or pure spirit. And this real God, it has nothing to do with the material world at all. And this leads to a large number of really speculative stories or myths that the Gnostics have put out about how a typical explanation is that the true good God, who is, remember, a higher level deity, several levels up from the God of the Bible, either created or emanated. And that's a concept that Gnostics like, emanated, other divine beings, which are called archons, who either emanated other archons or got together and reproduced with themselves until a mishap or a mistake was made by Sophia, that's the Greek word for wisdom, who is one of the archons, made a mistake, and that led to the creation of the evil archon, who created our world and actually just is simply pretending to be the real God when he actually isn't. And this evil archon, this is important, hides truth from humans, but he can't get away with his evil scheme because some sparks of divine wisdom have been left in human beings by this evil but somewhat stupid deity. And therefore, humans have an innate urge to return to the divine realm of the higher God who exists only in the world of pure spirit or pure thought. I kind of wonder if any of this is triggering any thoughts in your mind like it is in mine. Remember the Joni Mitchell song Woodstock? We've got to get ourselves back to the garden. That's kind of the same idea here. So, from the standpoint of the Christian believer, right off the bat, we see a radical departure from traditional Orthodox biblical Christianity, right? God is one. That's the Shema in the Old Testament. Deuteronomy 6:4, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one God. And Jesus repeats the Shema in Mark 12:29. But for the Gnostic, monotheism is out, and there are multiple gods which have to be brought in to explain why the material world does not have anything to do with God himself, the real God. And secondly, we have a dramatic departure from traditional Orthodox Christianity in that the body was not created good to the Gnostic, whereas in Genesis 1:31, after God creates man, he says, and all the rest of creation, he says, behold, it is very good, referring to the entire creation, including man. And last but not least, we have a dramatic departure from traditional Christianity with regard to the physical body. Traditional Christianity has always taught that the body is of equal importance with the spirit and that the body will be resurrected on the last day. I'm not going to quote you scriptures on that. If you want them, I can get them for you, but I would just point to the fact that in the Apostles' Creed, which came into existence very shortly after the time of Christ and has been confessed by Christians ever since, we state that we believe in the resurrection of the body and the life everlasting. Gnostics do not believe in the resurrection of the body, obviously, since the body is evil and like everything else in the material world. The goal is to get rid of it, to escape from it, and rejoin the realm of pure spirit. Okay, now let's talk a little bit more about the theology or doctrine of the man and what is man's major problem. Well, we've already pointed out that to the extent that man is physical or material, he is evil and not a good thing. But more important is the fact that man's real problem to the Gnostic is not sin, but rather ignorance. And the Gnostic really has a convenient excuse for sin, if you want to think about it that way, and I think that's what it happens in reality, in the real world, because he can say, it's really not the real me who's sinning. It's that fleshly body that's sinning. My real me, my spirit, is not sinning, and so therefore it's kind of not my fault. And you can very easily see that this line of thinking led the Gnostics into really some very negative teachings about marriage, about the family, and more to the point for our episode today, the understanding and the belief that natural distinctions, in other words, distinctions that we find in the created order, and particularly the distinction between male and female, those are an illusion. And this line of thinking, this Gnostic line of thinking, had a whole lot to do with the fact that the teaching of celibacy crept into the Christian church during the Middle Ages. Celibacy denies sexuality and really is an abhorrence of marriage itself. Okay, let's talk about the theology of Jesus from the Gnostic and Christian standpoints. As we've already said, to the Gnostic, Jesus didn't come to save men from sin, but rather to impart secret knowledge and to be a true spiritual teacher. Again, that kind of sounds familiar, doesn't it? We hear this constantly in culture today. Jesus was a great moral teacher. He was a great spiritual guide. So what secret knowledge did Jesus come to give us as to the Gnostic? Well, the knowledge that man is a basically good spirit that's trapped in an evil material body. And only by escaping the material world can man become truly liberated and truly himself. So that, to a Gnostic, is salvation. If he doesn't accomplish that, he remains in his original state, in which he is alienated from his true self. You may recall we get that alienation concept picked up in Marxism. And of course, the Christian person will ask, well, then what about Jesus' death on the cross? Well, we've talked about the fact that no self-respecting deity, to a Gnostic anyway, would ever stoop to humanity. So they essentially taught that Jesus didn't really die on the cross, but he only appeared to die. And the teaching really was that his spirit descended on him at his baptism and was taken up from him, removed from his physical body before his death, so that he only appeared to die on the cross. That is a heretical teaching known as Docetism. Docetism comes from the Greek word for appear or appearance. So the Gnostics would deny the incarnation. They would deny that Jesus actually died on the cross. So, of course, it's not necessary to say that that is a radical departure from traditional Christian teaching. So the bottom line for the Gnostics is the Old Testament is basically entirely out. And one of the main teachers of early Gnosticism, I think in the 2nd century, Marcion, actually tried to publish a Bible which entirely omitted the Old Testament. It also omitted Matthew, Mark, and John because he felt those were too heavily influenced by the Old Testament, which, as to the Gnostic, presents an evil, rather stupid God. And the bottom line is also, as we've said, that Jesus Christ did not come in the flesh. One of the early church fathers, a man named Tertullian, great hero of the faith, wrote extensively against Gnosticism. He said, quote, "Now, if his death, that is Jesus' death, be denied because of the denial of his flesh, there will be no certainty of his resurrection. Similarly, if Christ's resurrection be nullified, ours also is destroyed," close quote. So Tertullian certainly got it. If Jesus is not a real man with real flesh and blood who really died, he simply cannot save us. And for the Gnostic, because your soul is the real you and your body is just raw material, sort of, that you can do with what you want, then salvation is redefined as the spirit or the soul's physical permanent escape from the body. Life in this physical body is a prison from which one must be freed. And you can very easily see that this teaching, as it was practiced by the Gnostics in the early centuries, the first few centuries after Christ, went in one of two directions, and it actually went in both directions. One was extreme physical self-denial, and one was extreme physical self-indulgence, which often culminated in huge and incredibly debased orgies. Because if you follow the line of thinking that we've just been talking about, you can really go in either of those directions. Now, before I bring this up to modern times, as I promised I would do, I want to say a word about the Da Vinci Code and the so-called Gnostic Gospels. Now, this is a big subject. It may actually deserve its own separate episode. I'm not going to go there today, but I'm just going to give you the bottom line. There have been recent discoveries of Gnostic writings. This has led to a resurgence of interest by various scholars and popular writers like Dan Brown, movies like The Da Vinci Code, and so forth. And the claim is made that these so-called Gnostic Gospels have been the subject of basically a power play by the church, and have been excluded from and should have been part of the Bible. And you will hear this claim made over and over in popular media and social media today. Sometimes they will cherry pick certain quotes from these so-called Gnostic Gospels that kind of sound more traditional and more orthodox, and they'll say, hey, these are just like the ones that are in the Bible. These so-called Gospels really should be included. Well, that is a claim that no one who has actually read the full texts of these writings and compared them in good faith to the writings that we find in our Bibles could ever make with a straight face. You look at, for example, the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Thomas. Those are probably the two that most frequently come up. They have Jesus saying things that would be 100% contradictory to the things that he says in the New Testament. Again, I'm not going to go through line by line attempts to prove that to you, but what I'm going to do is quote from an article that I will link to in the show notes. It's from the Banner of Truth publication. It's a very well-documented article called Gnosticism. And here's the bottom line on the issue of the Gnostic writings. The Gnostic literature is nothing like the New Testament Gospels, and to regard them as ever having been contenders to be included in those Gospels is to engage in historical revisionism of the most baseless sort. Not only does the content of these works differ markedly from that of the Gospels, but there is no evidence from antiquity that they were ever regarded by anyone as equal to those documents. Far from providing exciting and alternative historical accounts of the life and teaching of Jesus of Nazareth, they can be seen on their faces to be later works presenting the teachings of small sects that had no meaningful connection to the historical Jesus, end quote. Okay, now we're almost 30 minutes in, so we're going to bring this up to the current time. Jeff, what does this have to do with the woke movement today? Well, fast forward to the 1960s, when a lot of things are going on. There is more or less I would say, semi-toxic stew of ideas floating around America, particularly in its college campuses. One of which, as we've already talked about, is critical theory or neo-Marxism. These folks wanted to criticize and eventually do away with the traditional family. They saw it as a social structure that needed to be torn down as part of the long march through the institutions of culture. And where were they marching to? Well, they were marching to the revolution that would bring about utopia in the Marxist scheme, since the economic class conflict that had been predicted by Marx himself largely had failed to bring about that revolution. So, as part of the effort to bring down these cultural institutions like marriage, like the family, critical theorists looked around. They said, well, what better way to accomplish this than to detach the concept of gender from its biological basis in the name of course, liberation. And so starting in the academic world, they started to challenge the issue of what they called the sexual binary, the traditional male-female distinction, and they wanted to replace it with what they called gender fluidity. Their goal was to undermine the concept of maleness and femaleness as universal absolutes. And again, in the interests of time, I'm not going to attempt to prove that to you, but you can find this very clearly in writings that they were publishing at the time. They didn't make a secret of it. They did sometimes cover it up with high-sounding academic jargon and gobbledygook, but it's clearly there. It's clearly in the record. Others have documented it. You can go to James Lindsay's New Discourses podcast in particular. And it wasn't just maleness and femaleness, of course. They wanted all universals. They eventually got around to calling these meta-narratives, among other things. All of those had to go. Now you say, that is a pretty tall order. How are they going to get people to buy into that? Well, they did it largely by teaching and declaring and propagating and propagandizing people with the idea that the self is autonomous. And that's just a mashup of two Greek words, which mean self-law, or law unto oneself. And this really became the battle cry of the sexual revolution that started in the 1960s, which is really a rebellion. It's a total rebellion. The self becomes totally sovereign with no controls and no limits. Let me give you a quote, which I will link to in the show notes, an article called The New Gender Gnostics. The modern sexual revolution is a revolt against the Christian God. It is a revolt motivated by the self-righteous conviction that the highest good for the human being is freedom, defined as freedom from constraint. There is no appealing the decrees of this tribunal, for there is no higher court. The individual human being, defined as mind or consciousness or will, is supreme, and no church, no government, no philosopher is permitted to tell it what to do. A particular action can be good, bad, or indifferent in itself or for other people, but when it is chosen by the sovereign self, it magically becomes the good for that person. The self has become a god, just as the serpent said in Genesis 3, and this God determines good and evil for itself. Close quote. Now, enter the concept of ancient Gnosticism, which becomes very helpful to advance this argument. To the Gnostic, remember, the true self is not the limited, sort of loathsome body, but the spirit that's trapped inside the body. So because that spirit is your true self, and it's radically autonomous and sovereign over everything else, it can't have any limitations of any kind, and certainly not physical limitations in a physical body. And you can already see where this is going. Here's where Gnosticism became very helpful to the neo-Marxist movement. In a very important section of the Gospel according to Thomas, one of the Gnostic writings, we have Jesus saying the following, quote, "When you make the male and female one and the same, so that the male not be male, and nor the female female, then you will enter the kingdom," close quote. And this, my friends, is how we arrive at the transsexual movement that we see around us today. If you believe that you are a male trapped in a female body, or vice versa, the body must be made to fall into line with the real you. And because the real you is the autonomous self, the sovereign self, any kind of procedure, any kind of surgery, any kind of drug, whatever it takes to free you from this prison is totally okay. If the real you is what you feel deep inside, and if you hold the Gnostic belief that the physical is bad, then if the real you is telling you that you really are the other sex, the answer is very simple. You have sex change, sex reassignment surgery, or as they're calling it now, gender-affirming care. And that's all good because gender identity trumps biological reality in the Gnostic worldview. What is good, that is God's physical human creation, male and female, becomes evil for the Gnostic. And what is evil, rebellion against God's created order, becomes good. And of course, this is the same logic, twisted though it is, that underlies abortion. The place where you can most clearly see this is in Justice Anthony Kennedy's language in the 1992 Supreme Court case of Planned Parenthood versus Casey. Quote, "At the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life," close quote. So because my inner feelings, which are no different from my inner self, they are essentially my identity, are more important than any physical reality, then I can decide what life is and what life isn't, and I can decide what sex or what gender I am, and no one can tell me otherwise. It's critical to not only your identity, but really your very survival to be liberated as quickly as possible, like tomorrow, if possible, from the prison of a body that doesn't line up with who you really are. And no one has the right to say who you really are except for you, not your parents, not a doctor, and certainly not the government. Not that you have to worry very much about that at the moment, because the current administration endorses all of this wholeheartedly, both with respect to abortion and with respect to trans rights, so-called. I just can't help but wonder whether Justice Kennedy, who really thought of himself as more or less a philosopher king, if he ever thought when he wrote those lines in 1992 about the heart of liberty in Planned Parenthood versus Casey, that this kind of situation that we see today would ever come about. And yet, if you think about the trajectory of the ideas, they are very closely related. They really could have been foreseen, and they were really almost predictable. You can draw a straight line between the two. Now, as Carter points out in his article, The New Gender Gnostics, and it should be obvious from the discussion that we've had so far, the biblical view of human sexuality and this neo-Marxist Gnostic view of sexuality are completely and diametrically opposed. They cannot coexist. I am sorry to say that many Christian people do not yet seem to understand this, but it is nevertheless true. I'm going to give you a quote from his article. Quote, "The end game is the complete destruction of the sexual binary, which would mean the end of natural marriage and the end of the organization of society around the family," end quote. And I don't think that's an exaggeration. To the Gnostic, rebelling against nature and the natural order really becomes morally justified, and actually it almost becomes a heroic duty. And you can see this in countless Disney movies. The hero finds themselves through some difficulties and learns, gets in touch with their true self after being constantly admonished to be yourself. And of course, I don't really need to say that this is directly contrary to the Christian view, the biblical view of human nature, which is found in many places, among them Jeremiah 17:9. "The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it?" But for the Gnostic, if life is all about creating one's own identity, even if that means erasing the identity that was given to the person, their sex, their family, their race, their nationality, you can identify with anything you want to, and all of reality, including your own body, and including other people's speech, by the way, must be altered to accommodate your desires. And if that means suppressing someone else's free speech, that's okay. We can do that. And the reason we can justify that is because this is all an evil prison that you have to escape from in order to free your spirit, to free the real you. For the true Gnostic, we can see that all of reality, and especially what Christians would call God's created order, All of it is inherently oppressive and it must be overturned. That means there has to be a revolution, an open rebellion. And you can see why this resonates with the neo-Marxists, the critical theory advocates, and the woke. And this is where critical theory and Gnosticism have come together to form a major support for the woke movement. It is truly a revolution, a rebellion against reality. Now, this all sounds very disturbing, and it is disturbing. But the funny thing about reality is that it's real, whether we like it or not, whether we know it or not, whether we accept it or not. And that means that reality will eventually come crashing in on these thought systems, as it has against all anti-God, anti-Christian thought systems. It may help to remember that the Bible clearly teaches God will have the last word. In putting all this together, my thoughts turned to Psalm 2, as they often do turn to the Psalms. The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, "Let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us." He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, "As for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill." Lest I be misunderstood, I'm certainly not suggesting that Christian people should sit back and do nothing. In fact, I'm suggesting exactly the opposite. We need to get involved. We need to expose these theories. We need to pull down vain philosophies and things that hold themselves up against the truth of God's word. And as we do that, we can take comfort in the fact that God has history all well within his sovereign grasp. And that is where we're going to leave it for today. In the next episode, we will move on to the third leg in the three-legged stool that's supporting the current woke movement in terms of ideology, and that is postmodernism. I hope this has been helpful to you today. If you have any feedback, please email me at diggingfordiamonds99@gmail.com. Or you can review my podcast on any of the platforms I mentioned at the beginning of this episode. You can also subscribe to this podcast. You can share it with your friends. I hope that you and your friends will join me for the next episode of Later Than You Think.